Borussia Dortmund are one of the best-run clubs in European football. Despite having close to half the revenue of Bayern Munich, and a budget equivalent to just 60% of the Bavarians, Dortmund only missed out on the Bundesliga title by virtue of goal difference last season, and they would have won the league but for a draw with Mainz on the final day of the campaign. Borussia Dortmund have roughly the same sized wage bill as Premier League relegation candidates Everton and already relegated Leicester City. Dortmund themselves, by comparison, have been Bundesliga runners-up in 4 out of the last 5 seasons and have only failed to qualify for the UEFA Champions League once in the last 12 years. In the last 2 years alone, Dortmund have sold Jude Bellingham, Jadon Sancho, and Erling Haaland for a combined total of almost €300 million. None are actually their record sale, that title belonging to Ousmane Dembele, who was sold to Barcelona for a potential €145 million 6 summers ago. Despite their frugality, Dortmund still rank 13th in the Deloitte Football Money League, above Inter Milan, AC Milan, and Newcastle United. There are those who question why Borussia Dortmund don't just spend a bit more, pay slightly higher wages, and look to compete with Bayern and Europe's biggest clubs. But to understand the Dortmund of 2023, the plucky, innovative, and frugal underdogs up against the Bayern juggernaut in the Bundesliga, you must first understand how and why the club very nearly died less than 20 years ago. During the mid-1990s, Dortmund tasted genuine success for the first time in over 30 years. In 1995 and 1996, they won back-to-back Bundesliga titles, never previously having been crowned as German champions during the Bundesliga era, and in 1997, they followed that success up with their first ever UEFA Champions League crown. Dortmund's hierarchy liked the feeling of winning, which club doesn't, but they were prepared to do just about anything to cling onto it. What ensued was almost a decade of some of the most reckless spending in the history of European football, culminating in a crisis which came within literal minutes of costing Dortmund their very existence. In the nearly 2 decades since, the events of Dortmund's near-death experience have become the stuff of legend, with various claims and counterclaims surrounding those ultimately responsible, how Dortmund managed to pull through, and, perhaps most controversially of all, the significance of a €2 million loan from their great rivals Bayern Munich, which only became public in 2012. So, following a number of requests, it must be said, I thought that it would be interesting to take a look at Borussia Dortmund's wild spending, close run-in with death, and staggering revival when compared with other clubs who have come that close to total collapse. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Germany's industrial heartland, where football and Borussia Dortmund means everything, but was very nearly lost to a community forever. Borussia Dortmund have always been underdogs. Founded by a group of young men in opposition to the strict Trinity youth football team, controlled by the local Catholic church and parish priest, Dortmund instead took their prefix, Borussia, from a local brewery. Success was hard to come by, and after a brief spell trying to pay professional footballers in a bid to improve their fortunes, the exorbitant costs almost saw Dortmund declared bankrupt in 1929. The club survived, but some of their staff didn't following the rise of the Third Reich, executed in the final days of the war for using the club's offices to print anti-Nazi pamphlets. Borussia Dortmund's president wasn't executed, but he was forced to step down and replaced by a party stooge after refusing to join the Nazi party. It was during the 12-year Third Reich that Dortmund's status as underdogs was really cemented, namely in opposition to their local rival Schalke. Still one of the fiercest derbies in all of German football, known as the Rebirth derby, it was a bit of a mismatch in truth. Schalke were the most successful club of the Nazi era, winning 6 German championships and reaching 9 national finals in only 12 years. Meanwhile, Dortmund never reached a single final. In fact, Dortmund began the Nazi era in the 2nd tier of the Westfalen District League, only winning promotion to the Gauliga Westfalen, which Schalke won every single season, in 1936. By the time Dortmund's golden generation rolled around in the mid-1990s, they had won just 3 German championships, all between 1956 and 1963, and were trophyless since the 1960s, barring a single DFB Pokal. Dortmund's president and CEO at the time was a local lawyer named Gerd Niebaum, who became president in 1986, when Dortmund were once again on the brink of bankruptcy and relegation. In the 1985-86 season, Dortmund finished 16th in the Bundesliga, only managing to retain their top-flight status through victory in the second Bundesliga promotion-relegation playoff. After their 2-legged playoff time with Fortuna Cologne ended in a 3-3 draw in aggregate, a replay was required, which Dortmund won 8-0 and lived to fight another day. Over the next few years, Niebaum built Dortmund back up into a formidable force within the Bundesliga, winning the DFB Pokal in 1989 and finishing second in the league in 1992. Dortmund were actually tied on points with Stuttgart in the 1991-92 season, in the first season following reunification in which East German clubs competed in the Bundesliga, missing out on the title by virtue solely of goal difference. Sound familiar? Having come so close, Niebaum and the rest of the Dortmund hierarchy were determined to push even harder in order to realise their ambitions. Matthias Sammer, formerly of Stuttgart and one of the best defenders in the world, was brought in for big money from Inter Milan. Fellow German international Stefan Reuter, formerly of Bayern Munich, was signed from Juventus. Stefan Freud was prized away from Dortmund's bitter rival Schalke. Karl-Heinz Riedel arrived for a club record fee from Lazio, and Andreas Mola and Julio Cesar were both brought in for significant fees from Juventus. This was serious investment, and it paid off. In 1991, Dortmund appointed Ottmar Hitzfeld, and in 1995, they won their first Bundesliga title, followed by a League and Super Cup double the following season, and a Super Cup and a UEFA Champions League double the season after that. From near extinction just a decade ago, Borussia Dortmund had become bona fide German and European powerhouses. To say that it went to Niebaum and co.'s heads would be something of an understatement. The European crown, most notably of all, twinned with falling from first to third place in the Bundesliga that season, seemed to have a particularly profound effect. They were no longer content with being plucky underdogs. Now Dortmund saw themselves as European giants, and they intended to spend as such. The following summer, Heiko Herrlich, Jürgen Koller, and Ruben Sousa were signed for a combined total in excess of the equivalent of 10 million euros. Dortmund broke their spending records again in the summer of 1998, again in 1999, 2000, and 2001. Following their Champions League win, Dortmund had actually slumped to a miserable 10th place finish in the Bundesliga, and in the 1999-2000 season, they fell even further into 11th. Instead of reflecting upon those failures, taking stock of the significant income shortfalls caused by a lack of European football, and redressing their spending as a result, Niebaum figured that the problem was that they hadn't spent enough. In the 2001-02 season, Dortmund broke all Bundesliga spending records, signing Brazilian international Marcio Amoroso for a German record 50 million Deutschmarks, or 25 million euros, along with Jan Koller for more than 20 million Deutschmarks, in a summer of spending that was exceeded only by Real Madrid. In the short term, Niebaum was vindicated. Under the management of former star signing Matthias Sammer, Dortmund won their first Bundesliga title since 1996 in the 2001-02 season, finishing 1 point above perennial nearly men Bayer Leverkusen and heralding their return to the UEFA Champions League. In the long term, Niebaum would be forced to resign in disgrace and later convicted of fraud. In the words of Gerd Niebaum's successor, Hans-Joachim Watzke, who is still Dortmund's CEO today, it is pretty simple. Over time, if you spend 20 or 30 million euros more than you earn, and you don't have an oligarch or a nation like Abu Dhabi or Qatar to support you financially, then at some point you have a problem. End quote. Well, Dortmund did indeed have a problem, and a pretty big one, though the true extent of the plight facing the club only reached the public domain in 2005. By that stage, Dortmund had been hemorrhaging money for the best part of a decade, and their malaise was exacerbated by the club's hierarchy refusing to acknowledge that there were any problems for years, and instead using various financial tricks, shenanigans, and short-term wranglings in order to maintain their spending levels and postpone the inevitable reckoning that was to come. I don't suppose that sounds familiar at all, does it? I can't imagine that there would be any contemporary examples of a club doing something as reckless as that. Dortmund's demise, along with a handful of other German clubs, was accelerated by the collapse of the Kirk Group in 2002, with debts of nearly €6 billion. The Kirk Group's main asset was Kirk Media, whose subsidiary Kirk Sport owned the broadcasting rights for the Bundesliga. The company's demise meant a collective shortfall of €1.5 billion across the Bundesliga's 18 teams. It sent all 18 into a state of crisis and uncertainty, but for Dortmund, who had just won the Bundesliga title, it was existential. To plug the financial black hole, and in a desperate attempt to pay their most urgent creditors, Dortmund either sold or pawned virtually everything that the club had once owned. From the newly renovated Westfalenstadion and the club's own independent kit manufacturer, all the way through to the right to their own name and badge, all flogged off to the highest bidder. The Westfalenstadion, just to give one example, was sold for €75.4 million to investors and leased back to Dortmund for €13 million a season in 2002, until Dortmund would regain ownership status in 2017. It was all part of Dortmund's desperate desire for grandeur. They didn't just want to have the best team, but the best stadium, the biggest capacity, and the most VIP seats. The Westfalenstadion's capacity was raised to 65,000 for the 2006 World Cup, and it meant that Dortmund were successful in their bid to host one of the semi-finals. The 15 years with a €13 million lease ended up costing the club €195 million though, an enormous fee in comparison to the €75.4 million that they sold the ground for in the first place. If you think that sounds mental, and it is, Nybaum was seriously considering the possibility of building a roller coaster to go around the Westfalenstadion. It was all part of Dortmund's innovative strategy to be at the forefront of football entertainment, which often seemed to focus on almost every aspect of the club's operations other than the football itself. A reminder, just in case one were needed, that this was a club mired in an unspoken crisis and up to their eyeballs in debt. All the while, the CEO was floating the serious possibility of turning one of Europe's most iconic football stadiums into a theme park. It was fitting in a way, not because Dortmund really were leading the way in innovation, but because the club had become a total circus, and the boardroom at the Westfalenstadion was already living in a fantastical world of make-believe. Throughout all of this madness, Dortmund just kept on spending. You might have thought that, at the point at which you are selling your stadium with the promise to buy it back for an additional €120 million, along with your badge and name to an insurance firm, with a €5 million and rising unpaid tax bill, you would start to curb your transfer expenditure to somewhere in the region of €0, whilst taking a sledgehammer to your wage bill. Oh no, not at Borussia Dortmund. In the summer of 2002, fresh off the back of their Bundesliga title win, and despite the Kirk Group's collapse plunging the club ever deeper into crisis, Dortmund saw off competition from some of Europe's biggest clubs to sign Torsten Frings for €10 million. The following summer, presumably using Wonga loans by this stage, a contractual clause forced Dortmund to sign Brazilian wingback Evan Nilsson for an enormous €15 million. At the same time that Dortmund was still throwing silly money about, having dropped to third in the 2002-03 season, they were pawning the literal transfer rights to their own players, namely some of their most valuable players, in the forms of Tomasz Rosicky, Everton, and Christoph Metzelder. German property magnate Albert Saal, who was a lifelong Bayern Munich fan, lent the club €15 million. But that loan was secured against the transfer rights of those three high-profile internationals. Unhappy at Dortmund's inability to repay his loan, Saal once turned up to a meeting of the club's creditors dressed in a lederhosen. It was around this time that another high-profile Bayern Munich fan, and indeed Bayern's general manager, Uli Hoeneß, agreed to lend Dortmund €2 million on behalf of the Bavarian Giants. 20 years on, it has become possibly the most controversial and hotly debated financial arrangement in the history of German football. It's often said that, because of that loan, Bayern saved Dortmund. That is something of a gross exaggeration. Dortmund were in €122 million of debt at the time. Bayern's loan, therefore, equated to less than 2% of Dortmund's overall liabilities. It alone came nowhere near to saving them. Nonetheless, when it came to paying Dortmund's most urgent and demanding creditors, it's also true that every little helped, and there weren't many people or institutions that would have lent to the club at the time. What's more, Dortmund's loan was interest-free, so long as it was repaid in the next 6 weeks, which was all that Dortmund said that they needed it for at the time. After 6 weeks, €1.5 million was repaid. The remaining €500,000 accrued 5% interest until it was settled by offsetting the sale of Torsten Frings to Bayern in 2004. It wasn't exactly charity then, but the terms were far more favourable than anything that Dortmund could have received from any financial institution. The Bayern loan went totally unreported by either side until February 2012. When Uli Hoeneß, by this stage Bayern's president, and on the verge of serving an 18-month sentence for tax evasion, revealed all. Hoeneß told reporters, quote, "When they, meaning Dortmund, were aware that they could no longer pay their salaries, we gave them €2 million without collateral for a few months. I'm a big fan of tradition in sport, and I don't think that was a bad thing to do." End quote. The timing of Hoeneß's comments, purely coincidentally I'm sure, came just as Dortmund had leapfrogged them in the race for the Bundesliga title, and shortly after it was confirmed that they had beaten Bayern to the signing of Borussia Mönchengladbach star Marco Reus. There are some in Dortmund who believe that the loan in of itself was always a cynical ploy, providing Bayern with permanent leverage and bragging rights that they could always lord over their rivals. Given the relatively small size of the loan then, some wish that the club had never accepted. That is probably a little bit fanciful. If Bayern's intentions really were wholly misanthropic, the easiest thing to do would have been to say that Dortmund had it coming and simply to let them burn. After all, it is hard to imagine, just for example, if after 15 years of enormous spending, Manchester City suddenly revealed that they were in dire financial trouble, that the Glazers would come to their beck and call, even with a relatively modest loan. Or, if things were to go south for Chelsea and Todd Bowley, that Spurs or Arsenal under Daniel Levy or Stan Kroenke would offer them a helping hand. Quite frankly, it seems more likely that they would race to the Premier League, demanding an immediate points deduction or Premier League expulsion. After all, Dortmund's massive spending denied Bayern of at least 1 and possibly 2 Bundesliga titles, and even Champions League qualification one season. As perilous as the situation at Dortmund was, sympathy would have been in short supply throughout most of the world's football leagues. It is also worth noting that Bayern's €2 million loan to Dortmund was made in 2003, a couple of years before Dortmund's financial crisis had really come to a head. To say that Bayern saved Dortmund, therefore, simply isn't true, but the idea that they only ever had cynical intentions is likely just as misplaced. Bayern, after all, also made favourable loans to 1860 Munich and St. Pauli when they faced similar financial hardship. It was only in early 2005 that the true extent of Dortmund's debt pile and fire sales were made public. When supporters discovered, most notably of all, the sale of the club's name and badge, there was understandable fury. On February 12, 2005, before a game against Bochum, Dortmund fans held a rally in opposition to the way in which the club was being run, uniting behind the now iconic slogan, "Not for sale." Dortmund fans, it would be remiss of me not to mention, had broadly bought into Nybaum's vision and were content with the club's spending and ambition. Of course, They weren't aware of the serious long-term harm that was being caused by that spending and various financial arrangements. And it is rare that supporters don't cheer on their clubs spending lots of money in a bid to become ever more competitive. When Leeds United threw tens of millions of pounds at the likes of Rio Ferdinand, Robbie Keane and Seth Johnson, there weren't mass protests outside of Ellen Road. It was only once the West Yorkshire club finished outside of the Champions League places and, just as with Dortmund, the extent of their debt became public knowledge that most fans became perturbed with their spending levels. Portsmouth fans certainly weren't complaining about signing the likes of Sol Campbell, David James, Peter Crouch and Jermaine Defoe, culminating the club's 2008 FA Cup win, but most were none the wiser in terms of the calamity that was still to come. You could argue that fans ought not be quite so naive, and I think that there probably is a greater awareness and concern surrounding financial recklessness now than there was 10 or 20 years ago. But for the most part, they just want to see their teams compete and are willing to afford a great deal of good faith towards their owners and administrators until proven otherwise. For Borussia Dortmund, it all came down to March 14th, 2005. The club was €122 million in debt. Failure to qualify for Europe, let alone the Champions League, in the 2003-04 and 2004-05 seasons, despite their spending, had reduced the club's annual revenue to just €75 million. In other words, their debt was equivalent to 163% of their revenue. It would take almost 2 seasons then, without paying any players, staff, or incurring any other operating expenses whatsoever, while somehow managing to maintain the same level of revenue, just for Dortmund to pay off their debt, let alone repurchase all of the assets that they had already flogged off. Of course, that would be impossible. A football club needs players, staff, and to fund their day-to-day operations, and even if they didn't, Dortmund still had to pay the €13 million a season lease just to play at the Westfalenstadion. As Dortmund's empire rapidly crumbled, Gerd Nybaum was forced to resign. He was replaced as Dortmund president by the politician and lawyer Reinhard Raubel, who had previously served as Dortmund president in the 1970s and 80s, and he was replaced as CEO by businessman Hans-Joachim Watzke, who had been the club's treasurer since 2001. Watzke was appointed CEO on a Tuesday, and on the Friday, he held crisis talks with the club's creditors. If the creditors weren't satisfied with what Watzke had to say and to offer them, Dortmund would be declared bankrupt on the following Monday, before Watzke had even had a week in the job. Bankruptcy, at that time, would have meant an enforced relegation to the 5th tier of German football. For former European champions and Bundesliga title winners less than 3 years ago, it was simply unimaginable. An official club statement finally made it clear to supporters that Dortmund's financial situation was threatening the existence of the club. There was immense relief when it was broadcast live that Dortmund's creditors had agreed to give Watzke and the club an extension to repay their loans, but that agreement came with a stark clause. At any time in the future, any one of Dortmund's creditors would be able to call in their loan with just 2 weeks' notice. If any of the club's major creditors chose to do so, Dortmund would have been forced to declare bankruptcy regardless. Furthermore, as part of the agreement, Dortmund would be overseen by a panel of their creditors for the next 2 years, who would tightly monitor their spending through to 2006. Watzke, together with Dortmund's sporting director Michael Zorc, managed to slash the club's budget from €57 to €24 million in the summer of 2005. Given that Dortmund had lost €27 million in the second half of 2004 alone, these were much-needed cost-cutting measures. But they didn't come without considerable risk themselves. More than halving the club's budget, off the back of a season in which Dortmund had finished 7th, 20 points above the relegation zone, and 22 points behind Bayern in 1st, meant that there was a real fear of relegation the following season. If you look at other teams at that time, both in Germany and throughout the continent, who had landed themselves in serious financial trouble and were forced into making fire sales, few in as dire financial predicaments as Dortmund, it should be said. There are virtually none that have fully recovered even now, and certainly none to the same extent or with the swiftness of Dortmund. Leeds United's demise, mentioned earlier on, coincided almost exactly with Dortmund's, but following their fire sales, they were relegated twice in 3 seasons, hit with a massive points deduction, spent 3 years in League One, and, despite a brief recent return to the Premier League after 16 years, are now back in the Championship once again. Portsmouth, meanwhile, have fared even worse. Pompey were relegated from the Premier League in 2010, during the same season that they reached their second FA Cup final in just 3 seasons. 3 relegations in 4 years landed Portsmouth in League Two by 2013, and despite being acquired by American billionaire Michael Eisner in 2017, they are yet to return to the Championship, let alone the Premier League. Over in Germany, FC Nuremberg at 1860 Munich faced similar crises following the collapse of Kirk Media in 2002. Nuremberg, who have been crowned German champions even more times than Dortmund throughout their history, were relegated in 2003 and are now a mid-table team in the second Bundesliga, where they have spent 8 out of the last 9 seasons. 1860 Munich, meanwhile, were relegated in 2004, never to return, and suffered a humiliating double relegation in 2017, relegating them all the way down to the regional 4th tier Regionalliga Bayern. They now compete in the 3rd Liga. Even Dortmund's bitter rival Schalke, whose crippling financial woes arrived a little bit later, have been relegated twice in the last 3 seasons, returning to the second Bundesliga last season. There are now more former German champions in the second Bundesliga than there are in the Bundesliga itself. Dortmund avoided a similar fate due to the fine work of Watzke and Zorc. Their lowest league finish came in the 2007-08 season, in which Dortmund finished 13th under Thomas Doll, but also made the final of the DFB Pokal. Throughout Dortmund's golden age, and into the early 2000s, the club had never been too reliant upon their academy structure. Stars had tended to be bought rather than developed. That all changed under Watzke, partly through necessity of course, since the club had no money, but it was masterfully carried out. Over the next few years, the likes of Nuri Sahin and Mario Götze came through Dortmund's own youth ranks. The real turning point, however, following that 13th place finish, was the appointment of Jurgen Klopp in the summer of 2008. Klopp had done a magnificent job at Mainz over the preceding 7 years, and Watzke was determined to bring him to Dortmund. Dortmund had a youthful, energised, and ambitious group of players. And as far as Watzke was concerned, there was no one better qualified to marshal them than Klopp. That summer, the whole mood of the club changed. Dortmund had a negligible net spend, but climbed all the way up to 6th in the division, just 5 points off the Champions League places. The following year, their net spend was just €4 million, but they welcomed the likes of Mats Hummels, Sven Bender, and Kevin Grosskreutz to the club. That took them up to 5th, and the summer of 2010 provided yet another key flashpoint in the club's revival. Shinji Kagawa and Lukasz Piszczek arrived free of charge, as Dortmund's net spend was less than €1 million, meanwhile Polish centre-forward Robert Lewandowski was signed for less than €5 million from Lech Poznan. The following season, 6 years on from very nearly going out of business altogether, Dortmund won the Bundesliga title. A year after that, they won the double, and then in 2013, they faced the club that had lent them €2 million a decade ago, whilst they were in crisis, in the final of the UEFA Champions League. Dortmund had done it all, effectively, without spending anything. And indeed, whilst continuing to pay back their debts, without state ownership, blood-stained billionaires, or even very many notable wealthy benefactors. The only major exception to that was Florian Homm, a hedge fund manager whose €20 million investment in Dortmund in 2004 through his Cayman Island-based company played a key role in supporting the cash-strapped club, whilst also helping to overthrow Dortmund's existing management through clauses attached to his investment. Dortmund have now gone 11 years without winning the Bundesliga title, as has, it should be said, every German football club that isn't called Bayern Munich. though they should have won it last season and finished level on points with the Bavarians. Even over the last 10 years, still Dortmund's CEO Hans-Joachim Watzke acknowledges players and agents have become much more impatient and demanding. That has made it increasingly difficult for Dortmund to keep hold of their best players, and the club has turned its attention to maximising profit, particularly on young players, when forced to sell them. In Ousmane Dembele, Jude Bellingham, Jadon Sancho, Christian Pulisic and Erling Haaland alone, Dortmund have raised nearly €500 million in player sales. That's the best part of €500 million on just 5 players. Dortmund have gone from being Germany's highest spenders on transfers to by far the league's highest earners, and close to the highest in all of Europe. It is a lesson in how to run a football club from a cash flow perspective, though it is also incredibly difficult to compete at the highest level as a stepping stone for players when your competition are almost all the final destination. Ultimately, Borussia Dortmund enjoyed a miraculous golden age in the mid-1990s, and they felt that that growth would continue forever. They spent money based upon that ill-fated assumption, and when it didn't come to fruition, they spent even more money in the delusional hope that one more signing would see their master plan come good. In October 2000, Nybaum even made Dortmund the first German football club to go public, raising €130 million on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. Shares in the club were initially listed at €11. Before the decade was done, the value of the club had dropped to below €1 a share. In 2012, Gerd Nybaum lost his license to practice law, and it was reported that his law firm had in excess of €17 million in liabilities. In 2015, he was given a 20-month suspended prison sentence for breach of trust, credit fraud, and forgery of documents. Before he resigned, Nybaum had been in talks to sell the next 12 years' worth of Dortmund's matchday revenue, in addition to the club's stadium, name, badge, kit manufacturer, and the transfer rights to several of their players. Dortmund's 2005 crisis was their third, and indeed their closest encounter, with total annihilation. This time, the club appears to have learnt their lesson. So the next time that someone asks you why Borussia Dortmund aren't a bit more ambitious, don't just roll the dice or throw a bit of money at things, now you know. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for both this channel and my second channel, both of which should be on or about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might want to watch after this one. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.